Well, hi. While I was out for a walk, I thought I'd drop you a little note about what was going on in 1945 as we begin our course. In 1945, the United States is still very much involved in the Second World War. You must remember that the Second World War is really not one war, but actually two wars going on simultaneously. There is the war in Europe and Africa against the Germans, the Nazis, and then there is also the war in the Pacific against the Empire of Japan. As 1945 opens, the war in Europe seems to be winding down. And so that war, the question isn't if the war will end, but more of a question of when it will end. Well, more on that later. The Empire of Japan, however, is fighting ferociously, and that war in the Pacific, there is great doubt in the United States as to whether or not a full-scale invasion of the islands constituting the country of Japan will be called for. And who knew what type of death or devastation would result from a full-on invasion? There was great concern in the United States that we would have to fight literally street to street, door to door, in order to subjugate this people. In 1945, we also see Franklin Roosevelt sworn in for a fourth term as president. Well, that may catch your ear because, of course, no president can run for more than 2 terms. Well, in 1944, you still could. There were no constitutional prohibitions against unlimited terms. In fact, because of Franklin Roosevelt running, and I suspect because he won 4 times, eventually a Congress will pass the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution, which will limit the number of terms that a president can run for to 2. But in 1945, Roosevelt will be sworn in for a 4th term. He takes the oath of office on the patio of the White House. That's a little different. Presidents have always taken the oath of office on the steps of the Capitol. Kind of a checks and balances, hey, we're going to work together kind of recognition. Roosevelt will take the 4th oath, his 4th oath, at the White House. He will also give the shortest inaugural address in history, somewhere in the neighborhood of 600 words. The reason he does this, well, he says it's because we are at war. And it doesn't seem right in the midst of a war with people being killed to have festivities or some sort of celebration. Well, that's certainly true as far as it goes. In Roosevelt's case, there was another even more pragmatic reason that he does not take the oath of office at the Capitol and does not give a longer address. The reason is he's dying. He has hypertension, exceptionally high blood pressure. He is in the midst of, frankly, heart failure. His son, James Roosevelt, was standing near him during that 4th very short inaugural address. And he could see his father starting to experience angina pains. He could see by the look on his face, the way in which he gripped the podium. And he wrote later that he wondered what it would be like for the country if his father, in the midst of the inaugural address, keeled over, dropped dead right there. Well, of course he didn't, but the fact that one of Roosevelt's sons, close on the scene, thought that way says something about the health of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. As the year 1945 progresses, we also see Nazi concentration camps liberated by Russian soldiers, English soldiers, and of course American soldiers. The horrors that these men saw, we cannot even begin to describe. It was in these death camps at Buchenwald and at Auschwitz and many others that over 6 million European Jews were put to death. What will Europe be like after the war for the survivors? What will the world be like? Well, that's later in this week too. In the United States, of course, we are coming out of the Great Depression that had lasted about 14 years, where unemployment was in double digits for all of those years, finally coming to a close. People, because of the war and government spending, are finally having money when they hadn't before. Around the world is starting to make preparations for a post-World War II world. That'll come a little later too, but we're thinking about the creation of a United Nations, a creation of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to help nations recover from the war, and certainly underdeveloped nations begin to develop. We are also looking at a world without European colonies. Colonies in Asia are starting to rebel against the French. India is rebelling against the English. Colonies in Africa are rebelling against all of those countries that had held them as colonies for about 100 years. What will that world look like? Well, again, that's going to be a little later, but I wanted to give you a bit of a heads up of what's coming as we get into 1945. Franklin Roosevelt will travel 16,000 miles to a little port in Russia called Yalta. He will there meet with the others of the victorious, or soon to be victorious, allies, the Russian Joseph Stalin and the English Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Churchill hated Yalta. In fact, he even said, "I think if you spent 10 years, you could not have found a worse place to have a conference than Yalta." It was cold, it was damp, it was winter. Stalin didn't feel like traveling. He had indicated he'd had a heart attack of some sort and doctors wouldn't let him travel. So Franklin Roosevelt, who in fact was dying, traveled the furthest to meet with his allies. What will the world look like? What will these three men create from this conference? In some ways, they really aren't talking to each other anymore, because in some ways, the armies are doing the talking now, outside of the grip and the control of the politicians. One of the issues that will be near and dear to both Churchill and Roosevelt's heart are free elections in Eastern Europe. Once the Nazis are defeated, will democracy control those Eastern European states? Stalin will give very vague promises about free elections. We will soon find out that his definition of free elections, Franklin Roosevelt's definition, and Winston Churchill's definition of free elections were very different one from another. Roosevelt will come back from this conference with one great success, which was he got the Russians to agree to join the war against Japan after the Germans are defeated. That was important because at this time we were still working on an atomic bomb, but we didn't know if it would work. We thought we would have to invade Japan and any help would be appreciated. Well, Roosevelt comes home, talks to Congress about the Yalta Agreement. He does it sitting down, which is very unusual for him, and actually in the televised radio address to the American people, no television yet, Roosevelt actually mentions that he's sitting down, and for the only time that I am aware in his career, he mentions his disability. As you may remember, 25 years before, he had gotten polio and was paralyzed. In this final address to Congress, he talks about how much easier it is to not have to stand and have about 11 pounds of steel, his leg braces, wrapped around his legs. 6 weeks later, he will go to Warm Springs, Georgia to get some sun, to rest a little. And it is there on the 12th of April, 1945, at about 3:30 in the afternoon, Franklin Roosevelt, the only president many Americans knew, the only president that served for 12 plus years, will die of a cerebral hemorrhage, a stroke, essentially, in Germany, in his bunker, with Russian and American shells exploding around him. Adolf Hitler hears the word that Roosevelt is dead, and he says, God has finally answered our prayers. We will now go on to victory. Well, didn't quite work out that way for him, as you will see when I talk to you again, maybe tomorrow, about the rest of 1945. Have a wonderful day. If you have any questions about 1945 or Churchill or Roosevelt or any of these guys that you'd like to ask, feel free to call, text, send me a note, whatever, and I will address it in one of my next broadcasts to you. Have a great day, you guys. I'm going to get out of here and go have a walk. Bye.